totally finished with Dream of the Rune. Did we start Beowulf at all the other day?
The last thing we talked about was the question of dating, like old.
Okay, question of dating, that kind of stuff. Early date versus late date. Early daters, and I'm not going to write this stuff back up on the board. The early dating group would essentially suggest that Beowulf was orally composed, okay, sometime after 600, probably, and going up to as late as 725, 750. Often you'll see a date of like 725 given for the early composition of Beowulf. The late daters, on the other hand, it's generally taken to be that the poem was composed possibly orally, possibly literate, that is written, after 900. Any time after that. And then there's, kind of an intermediate, well, maybe it's from some time in between. Generally the 9th century, 800 to 900. I think I mentioned before, or I may not have got to, a guy named, here's an example, I'm going to put something down. A guy named Kevin Kiernan, a scholar named Kevin Kiernan, and this is, I'm putting his name in case you get interested in this and you want to look more. In his book, Beowulf, in the Beowulf manuscript, which initially began as an article and then then it expanded it. He argues for a late date, a real late date for Beowulf. And by that I mean, he argues that the poem that we have in the manuscript is the only version of the poem that we have that ever existed. It sounds kind of silly, right, to say that? Part of what he's saying there is, in the manuscript, we see the poet actually create the Beowulf that we have. Because there's a page in the manuscript, and the manuscript is on vellum, calfskin. Okay? There's a page in the manuscript that has been erased. All the letters have been scraped off, and something else has been overwritten there. And he got a huge grant, he got several, huge grants from the National Science Foundation, NEH, etc., to do this big, massive study involving the British Library and him and somebody at Oxford to photograph, re-photograph all of Beowulf using ultraviolet lighting and all this kind of stuff, where you can now see, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it's a large number of the erased letters from that piece of vellum, because the ink bled into the flesh, and it's still able to be seen via ultraviolet light and things like that. Okay? That spot in the manuscript is the linkage between Beowulf's battles with what are called the Grendelkin, Grendel and his mother, and then his battle with the dragon. Because if you're familiar at all with the poem, what happens? He kills Grendel, he kills Grendel's mother, they have a little party, and then Hrothgar sends him home, or Beowulf wants to go home. He goes home, and within literally 20 lines, Beowulf becomes king, he's been ruling for 50 years, and a dragon shows up. Literally 20 lines. So he goes from being whatever age he is in the first half, 2/3 of the poem, to whatever age he was, plus at least 50 years in that final part in the battle against the dragon. And I'm going to suggest, I think it's entirely possible that when Beowulf fights the dragon, he's 100 years old. Yes?
Do you think that jump, because I know you had said that there were supposedly other texts of Beowulf that yeah.
Not of Beowulf, there might have been.
Okay.
There might have been other versions. And the only reason I said that is within the poem, the poet tells us of stories and songs of Beowulf that other people have heard. Hrothgar, when Beowulf comes in, Hrothgar is going to say, we've heard stories from the seamen, the sailors, about Beowulf's exploits. So there's an example of that kind of referentiality within the poem of other stories of Beowulf. We don't have any of those stories. There might have been those. A 19th century scholar by the name of Muhlenhoff, I was once going to write, a book on Beowulf. I had it pretty much all written up here. I've got literally a 4-drawer file cabinet this tall, full, just of articles on Beowulf. Okay, this guy in the 19th century named Muhlenhoff came up with what's called the leader theory or lay theory. Lay just means song. Okay, and he argued that Beowulf the Beowulf that we have is actually comprises about 20 different tales of Beowulf. And he thought he could piece them together. Or, let me rephrase that, he could piece out where these separate songs are all fused together. Okay? Nobody believes that. No modern scholars accept that idea. They might accept the idea that Beowulf existed in a previous form or existed in a couple of different tales. For example, Beowulf's fight against Grendel and his mother, one separate tale, and Beowulf's fight against the dragon, one separate tale. Why? Because he's apparently young in this one, old in this one. Big question is, where's the middle Beowulf? Well, to the poet, that's not important. Because, literally in the poem, in 10 lines, Beowulf goes from not being king to being king and having ruled for 50 years. And then, like in the next 10 lines, the dragon gets introduced. That happens on that sheet that was completely erased and overwritten. And Kiernan argues this is the poet, on the fly, so to speak, creating this. Okay? And after Canute becomes king, 1016. That's really late dating. For the simple reason, what happens 50 years? Canute becomes king in 1016. What happens 50 years later? 1016 plus 50 equals 1066. Norman conquest. End of Anglo-Saxon England. End of Anglo-Saxon literature. So if Kiernan's correct, Beowulf, the greatest surviving work of Old English literature, is composed within a generation of the decapitation of Anglo-Saxon culture. It's the apex of Anglo-Saxon culture. If Beowulf comes from an earlier period, 600 to 700, it's what? It's the very beginning of Anglo-Saxon culture. And thus you have, kind of that Anglo-Saxon culture reached its pinnacle here, let's say 700, and it's a gradual, slow decline down. The other theory, the late theory, it reaches its theory here, or its apex here, and then gets cut off. If the Norman conquest hadn't occurred, what else might have been produced? Okay? And Beowulf does contain fragments of other stories. There's a story in Beowulf called the Finnsburg Lay. Okay? Well, we have another manuscript. The manuscript itself is gone. A copy of it was made, called the Finnsburg Fragment. And it was probably a poem somewhat similar to Beowulf that recounts events that are in Beowulf. But that fragment is only about 300 lines or so. And most scholars think it was probably at least 1,000 lines. Okay? We, other than Beowulf and that fragment, we don't have any more of that.
What did you say it was called?
The Finnsburg Fragment, Finnsbur, and there will be variation in this, either an H, a G, or an H. It's pronounced Burr, not Gur, not Finnsburg, Finnsburg. Okay? We're going to see it after Beowulf defeats Grendel. Guy's going to come in, he's going to sing this great song. We'll talk about, is it really all that great? And what does it have to do with the poem? It has everything to do with the poem. Okay? So Kieran's a late dater. You might come up, if any of you decide to do anything on Beowulf or other Old English stuff, you might come across a guy by the name of R.D. Robert, I can't remember his middle initial, Folk. He's an early dater. His stuff is based entirely on the language detail in the poem. He's a true, what's called philologist. Someone who studies the history of the language as it exists in various points of time. And he will argue in his book on Beowulf, he argues there are pieces of evidence in the poem, okay, in terms of how sounds are created in the writing and such, that show the origin of this poem goes back to probably 700, if not earlier. Kiernan attempts to argue against that argument in his book. And when he did, Folk then wrote his book against that. And so you've got this, I mean, it's really a controversy. It's an argument. There's probably a lot more critics today who would take the early dating than would take the later dating. Okay? So let's start. Begins with Hwat, as did Dream of the Rood, as does Andreas, and a couple of other poems. Hwat, the Old English, and you've got the first page of the manuscript there, okay? So written in all caps, or what's called majuscule, large letters. Hwat we gardena in jaar de gum third kinninga thrim jefrunan hutha athalingus ellen fremedon. We have heard of the glory in bygone days of the folk kings of the Speardanes, how those noble lords did lofty deeds. Okay? So the poet begins speaking, and the poet immediately draws the audience in. How? Okay, how else? I mean, true. Pay attention, I'm singing now. We. It's not I. You know, how does, I don't remember if this is how he actually begins, the long version of it. How does Walt Whitman begin his Song of Myself? I sing. Okay? This is we. We what? We have heard. Notice the tense. It's not we hear. We have heard. When is that? Yesterday, day before. Okay? But it's continuing to the present. It's not, we heard it once and we haven't heard it anymore. We can keep hearing it, as it were. We have heard of the glory in bygone days. So when? I wish he hadn't used in bygone days. I wish he'd used the other phrase that comes directly from the word year dagum, days of yore. It's literally what that word means. Okay? He doesn't use in days of yore, however, because it sounds what? Fake, old, archaic, stilted. Well, how many of you use in bygone days? Well, in bygone, nobody says that anymore. Olden times, that would work. In bygone days of the folk kings of the Speardanes, folk kings, that is, the kings of the folk, the people. It's the people kings. That's all it means. Okay? Of the Speardanes. The Danes are going to be called a bunch of different things. You'll have an adjective in the name. Speardanes, South Danes, Victory Danes, Glory Danes, Bright Danes. You'll never have drunk Danes, though the poem is going to present them as every evening being drunk as skunks. I mean, just thoroughly wasted. That's why Grendel can come and kill them every night. And Beowulf's going to point that out, by the way, as an outsider coming in. So, how those noble lords what? Notice the time emphasis again. Did lofty deeds. What did the poet of the Seafarer say towards the end of the poem? He says, we don't have any longer what? Kings and Caesars like they did before. And he actually uses that word, we are worse, lesser men than they were. What is the poet doing? What's he telling his audience?
This isn't a, like, I would say a singular thing, just like all like acts like this have happened before.
Okay.
It's a
What?
better time.
It was a better time. Back when there were real heroes. In Tolkien's The Hobbit, you know why the dwarves and Gandalf come get Bilbo? If you've never read it, I'll give you a real quick version. Because they can't find any heroes. They're either all dead or they're off somewhere fighting a dragon. But the implication is because there aren't any heroes in the world anymore. So we have to hire a midget to come do our thieving for us. I mean, that's really what happens there. Okay? There are other Old English poems that compare the time of today versus the past. Look at The Wanderer. The Wanderer's all alone. There aren't any heroes around anymore. The speaker might be saying the same kind of thing. And this gets to the issue of dating. Where are the folk kings like the Spear Danes had, who did glorious deeds? Where are our kings doing glorious deeds now? It's kind of like today in politics, political culture. Every now and then somebody will write some column or something and they'll say, where are the men and women like we had in the American Revolution? Where are the John and Abigail Adamses? And without Abigail Adams, there would not have been a John Adams, by the way, if you don't know that story. She was his closest confidant. He bounced ideas off her. She said, John, that's a stupid idea. And he changed his ideas because smart man listens to his wife. Why don't we have founders like there were then? Where's the Washington, the Jefferson today? That's what the poet's doing. He's drawing attention to the lack. Okay, so dating. If the poem is composed early, 600-700, it's historically really close in time to the time of the deeds that are related here. Remember the other day I had written up over here? I may not have talked about it. At the date 520 with the name Helak. One actually dateable event in the poem. Because Helak was real. I mentioned several sources that refer to him. Jordanes, his History of the Goths, Gregory of Tours, History of the Kings of France, etc. Okay? What about now? So if it's early, it's kind of harder to do that. If it's a later date, 900 or 1000, it's written in Old English, it's an Anglo-Saxon speaker. Yeah, he's talking about Vikings, but it could also be, where are the kings who've done those kinds of deeds? Because what is happening in Anglo-Saxon England from roughly 790 on? Viking invasions. In other words, where are our kings doing glorious deeds fighting off the Vikings? Yeah, there was Alfred the Great, 20 years of peace out of 200. His son, a little bit of peace, expanded the kingdom some, and then the Vikings start ramping things up. I mean, even in 1014, Athelred flees because Vikings are invading. So the poet goes on. Oft shield ship, or often. Notice here it's the same word that was used in The Wanderer that got translated once, often, and the other time it's always. So often or always. Shield shoving seized the mead benches from many tribes. Troops of enemies struck fear into earls. not struck furrow into ears. Wow. What does that mean? He sees the mead benches? Does that mean, like, if I were to march to the back of that room, to this room, and grab that chair, and I bring it up here and say, my mead bench?
Took over the halls.
He took over the halls, meaning, what happened to the people who were in the halls? Yeah. He killed them. So he sees the mead benches. It's kind of euphemistic. It's putting it lightly. How did he strike fear into earls? Because a lot of people, when they die, they're full of fear. That's how. Though he first was found a waif. What's a waif? Again, not a word we use very much in modern English.
So like a ghostly entity.
Louder?
Like a ghostly entity.
No, that's wraith. This is a waif, W-A-I-F.
A weak, small person?
A meek, small person. Keep going. It's often, not all the time, it's not gender specific, but it's often a young girl who's alone. And I mean really alone. I don't mean mom and dad are off doing something. Orphan. A foundling. Another word we don't use very often. Go to England, and you can see all over the place foundling hospitals. Those are hospitals for orphans, for kids without homes. They're orphanages also. So Shield Sheving, his name means shield, son of sheaf, S-H-E-A-F. The ing, by the way, means son of. The ing ending, okay? Shield, son of sheaf. And you got a gloss telling you this is probably some kind of agricultural fertility god. Okay, sheaf is. He sees the mead benches, but he came first what? As a waif. And he awaited the term solace for that. The word solace almost always is used to translate the Old English word frovra, okay? Which is important because this is used throughout the poem. In other words, the poem seems to be about solace, or word that's related to that, consolation. What's the difference between solace and consolation? Solace is provided to me or to you individually. Consolation is solace together. The con comes from Greek and Latin co, it means with. So when you're consoling someone, you're sharing with their suffering, you're relieving it, you are, spreading the love, so to speak. So he was first found an orphan, and he awaited solace for that. The verb for awaited, it's the same one at the beginning of the Wanderer, just a different tense. Yabad rather than yabidon. Awaited, expected, experienced, longed for. All four of those also apply here, just like they did in the Wanderer. So he awaited consolation. Yes?
Can you spell that word again?
Here it's G-E-B-A-D. Okay? So he awaited solace for that. He experienced solace for that. He longed for. He grew under heaven and prospered in honor until every one of the encircling nations over the whale's riding had to obey him, grant him tribute. Over the whale's riding. What the hell is the whale's riding? What do whales ride? Waves. Thank you. Ocean. Why not just put, again, he's trying to kind of match the meter in the sound of the original, but it's the ocean. So what are we being told about Shield here? He arrived as an orphan. We're not told here, this passage yet, how he arrived. We are going to get told when he dies about how he arrived. He arrives the same way he left. Okay? So he arrives, he grows up, and what does he do? Scares the hell out of his neighbors. He terrorizes them. Okay? What have we been told? He seized the mead benches from many tribes, etc. He prospered in honor until all of the encircling nations had to obey him, grant him tribute. The encircling nations, if you look at the map, excuse me, that I put on D2L of the basic geography of Beowulf, he's probably, if the map's here, you've got Denmark sticking up off of northern Germany, and Germany comes over here, and then Russia's over there, etc. So Denmark comes up here, and Sweden, the peninsula of Sweden comes out here, and there's an island. There's a group of islands, actually, between Denmark and Sweden. He's on one of those islands, probably. And it's probably not in, it's called Zealand. You know, and then you get New Zealand in the South Pacific. The surrounding nations, all those coastal territories that are around that island. In other words, this guy was pretty fearsome because people miles away on the other side of the ocean paid him tribute. Why do you pay tribute?
Don't get attacked.
Say that again?
So you don't get attacked.
So you don't get attacked. Think of the mafia. It's a protection racket. The only difference, well, actually, it's not a difference. I was going to say the only difference is you're being protected from somebody else. Well, the mafia would tell you, you know, $20 a week and I don't break your kneecaps. Shield shoving is essentially doing the exact same thing. Pay me tribute and I'll leave you alone. Stop paying tribute and I'll attack. Remember when I mentioned before the Battle of Malden and how the battle did not need to be fought? Because Ethelred had already paid the Vikings tribute. We don't know why the English leader in that little locale, why he fought. He might not have known about the tribute being paid. Or it could just be that he was thinking, I'm an Englishman, this is my land, we're going to fight, you know. And so he rouses his troops and they all get slaughtered. Okay? Look at the end of the introduction about Scyld. That was a good king. The Old English reads, that was god king. There's no A, there's no determiner. That was god king. That phrase is used 3 times in the poem. Each time about a different king. So, because this section kind of ends with this sums up what we kind of need to know about shield shoving. So, the question then is, what makes a good king? I mean, we were told Scyld was a good king. What actions are we told that he does? That possibly makes a good king.
Seems like he takes charge.
He takes charge, meaning, yes, he does. He defeats his enemies, right? He deprives them of their mead benches. That means expanding territory. It doesn't just mean he kills them all and takes their benches back to his house. It means he takes possession of their hall. Keep in mind how important the hall is. So he expands his kingdom, and he becomes so fearsome that rather than have Scyld attack you, people go, no. You can have my wallet and my car. And they pay him tribute to not attack. Okay? He prospers, we're told, under heaven and in honor until everyone surrounding him pays this tribute. Niccolo Machiavelli, in his book The Prince, famously asked, what is it better to be, feared or loved?
Fear.
Machiavelli said feared. Much better to be feared. Okay? Not saying that's true, but obviously Shilcheving held to that school of political thought. And then we're told he has a child. Or a boy was later born to him, young in the courts, whom God sent as a, and that's that same word, as God sent as a solace to the people. He saw their need, the dire distress they had endured lordless for such a long time. Who's the subject? He. Because notice, it's not capitalized. It is God. God saw their need. Who is the there? Shield's people. Wait, how can that be? What need would they have that they endured lordless for such a long time? Is this Shield, dies and then has a son? Logically, that doesn't make sense. Shield has a son, then dies, but the child is still a baby and has to grow up, and while he's a baby, they are lordless? That's a possibility. Or another reading is Shield's son is a son in the sense of a descendant, not direct, patrilineal father-son. Could be father-grandson. But in these kinds of cultures, where primogeniture and that kind of stuff, where ancestry is all important, so-and-so is still a son of. Go look at, the opening of the book of Matthew. Son of, 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 all the way down the line. So that Jesus is called a son of David, or the son of David. He's not literally, directly, because David was 1,000 years prior. Okay? So, God sent this son to comfort the people, to console the people. The Lord of life, the wielder of glory, gave him, the son, worldly honor. And then we get the name of the son, Beowulf. And that is what the manuscript reads, Beowulf. But I would say probably 99%, more than that, of Old English scholars will argue not the Beowulf the poem is about. Probably a different guy actually named Beow, B-E-O-W. So why is it Beowulf here? Scribble screw up. The person copying the manuscript. Copying, notice, implies what? Louder? There was another one right here. And this person has the manuscript in front, and his eyes are moving ahead, and somehow, or he's thinking about what's coming up, and somehow he has the name Beowulf in mind, and he sees Beow, and he just writes Beowulf here when it doesn't belong here. Okay? It's just a copying error. I could write something down and hand that to each one of you and ask you to copy it. And probably what you would hand back would be identical to what I wrote. But I could also write something down and give it to you, and you could pass it to her, and it could go all the way around the room, each person copying what the other person wrote, and by the time I received it back from here, it wouldn't be the same. Have you ever played the telephone game? That's what it is. My first doctoral course was a course called Bibliography and Methods of Research, and we were doing textual editing. And the professor had written this really long, years prior, mock epic poem satirizing the president of his university. I mean, really long, several hundred lines. And he brought in one day a portion of it. And he gave each of us a copy, but then he also gave a copy to one person and said, I want you to copy the first 20 lines. And then pass your copy on to the next person. And we did that for a few days. And by the time it all came back, it was like, what was returned was like maybe 50% of what was in the original. What's one reason why? How many of you can read all of this when I write it up here? Yeah, I'm seeing looks on faces like, Sherman, you're the wrong kind of doctor. This looks like a prescription pad. Okay? You should see my son, the lawyer's. It's like a chicken stepped in ink and then, okay? That's one reason. And there might have been damages to if there was another manuscript, etc. So, Beowulf. So, this Beowulf was renowned. His fame spread. Yes?
Okay, so with that being said, we're still going with this is the shield shoving is Beowulf's father.
Shield shoving is this Beowulf's father. The shield shoving is not the father. Scholarly consensus is shield shoving is not the father of the Beowulf, the hero of this poem. Okay? And that's simply because this name, line 18, running out of places to write, should actually be Beow. And if you look at other translations, they will often read Beow. Like Seamus Haney's, I'm pretty sure, read one of the most important translations in the last, 50 years or so. Why? Because Seamus Haney is a Nobel Prize winning poet. And he translated Beowulf. Did not know Old English very well. He did study it as a student in Ireland. Translated it. Parts of it are really good. Most of it's really bad. Okay? But he does put, if I remember correctly, Beow, where the manuscript clearly reads Beowulf. Okay? So, different than the hero who kills the dragon and the two Grendels. Grendelkin, if you want. So this child of Scyld, we'll just call him that, was renowned. People knew stories about him. His fame spread wide in Scandinavian lands. What are the Scandinavian lands? Denmark, Sweden, Norway, primarily. Okay? Northern Germany, you could probably argue. And then the poet gives us a gnomic passage. Line 20 through 25. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions, so that later in life his loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. The people will support him. Let's leave the next line and a half off for a moment. Why does it say thus should? What does thus usually imply? Therefore, as this, it's a comparison. It's drawing a link between either what came before or what comes after. It's clear it's not what comes after, because what comes after is Scyld's death. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions, so that later in life, loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. The people will support him. That's kind of implying this is what Beow, I'll use the name most scholars say, did. When his father was old and Beow was now kind of ruling, let's say, he took from his father's treasure, distributed it to Thanes, and later in life they stood by his side when war came. That's the implication. Here's the wrinkle for this passage. And I think a possible indication of why the name that's given here is Beowulf. Our Beowulf, the guy who kills Grendel's mother and the dragon, late in the poem, when he's battling the dragon, only has one man stick by his side. And that man, who sticks by his side, actually goes against his orders. Towards the end of the poem, they know there's a dragon. Beowulf says, I'm a monster killer. I've got to fight the dragon. He gets his select group. He gets his Navy SEALs. He says, you guys come with me. And then he tells them, sit. I'm going to fight the dragon alone. And he starts fighting the dragon. And he's getting his you-know-what kicked. And one of those men says, I'm going to go help him. Who's with me? And they all go, run away, and they, say no. Beowulf, Beowulf's helper, goes and helps them. Together they defeat the dragon. The dragon dies, Beowulf gets bit. Sorry to give it away, Beowulf dies. Shortly thereafter. Beowulf then goes back to those other men and essentially calls them a bunch of cowards. And he said, what a waste it was when Beowulf gave you all that treasure when you didn't use any of it to stand by him at his time of need. Thus should a young man distribute his father's gifts. That is, take from the treasure hoard and distribute. Well, Beowulf did do that. We could debate whether or not he was young when he did that, or debate what his age was when he became king. We don't know. But when he fights the dragon, it's 50 years after he's been king. And only one of his men stand with him? Now, again, let's be fair to him. I try to take both sides. I try to be even, What did Beowulf tell his men? Sit. What did the cross tell us? Oh, I could have taken them all out. I could have leveled everyone. But that wasn't the command of his Lord. I was raised to be a cross. I had to follow his Lord, even though it meant, crucifying the Lord and such. So the men, good Germanic fashion, they're following their Lord's wishes. Of course, he's going to die, which is going to lead to other ramifications, which we'll talk about. So, now the last line and a half. With praiseworthy deeds, a man will prosper among any people. Prosper, will grow and do well. How? By doing heroic deeds, praiseworthy deeds. Okay? Scyld dies. Passes away, notice, at his appointed hour. Why? What is this life? Lana, loaned, lean, transitory, fleeting, etc. And we get a long passage about how they disposed, I don't want to say buried, how they disposed of Scyld's body. What did they do? Put him on a ship. How many of you have seen this in a movie? Somewhere. There's some Viking burial, and the Viking gets put out on the boat, and they send the boat out into the water, and some ace archer comes and dips his arrow in burning pitch, and the boat is now a postage stamp 500 yards off the coast, and it goes, and one shot. And it hits it in the middle, burns. Okay, there's a problem with that. How would we know about these burials, or these, if there's no evidence left? The Vikings did not leave behind much written accounts of funerals and such. Okay? But this guy's put in a boat. He's not burned. What else do they put in a boat? All kinds of stuff. Treasure. This is the source of Tolkien's burial of, thank you, Boromir. I kept thinking Tom Bombadil. It's like, no, Tom doesn't die. Boromir in The Lord of the Rings. And from lines 35 down, 35 to about 42 or so, 32 to 42, are important historically, culturally, okay? Because of the description of what is put in the boat. Here's why. 1024. In 1938, I should put that date down. 1938, a woman named Edith Pretty, who lives in East Anglia, England, lives present tense in 1938, and owns a bit of property, euphemism for owns a big chunk of land, decides to have an archaeologist dig into one of these mounds that is on her property. If I remember right, there's about 50 of them. Now, I don't mean mounds like, this kind of mound. The largest of them is 50 feet tall and over 100 feet in diameter. Big stinking mound. She knows what these are. Because everybody in England knows what these are, because they're all over England. Take a course in England sometime, go to Stonehenge, look at the pretty rocks, which you can't get too close to, pretend to be blind. I shouldn't say this, but I had a student once who was blind. Pretend to be blind, black glasses, white cane, and they'll let you go up and touch the stone. One of my colleagues who was leading this Arthurian trip, so because he was leading the trip and she was blind, he got to lead her, so he also got to go up and touch the stones. Or go summer solstice, because then you can go up and do your druid stuff all around the rocks and everything. I don't know why. Anyways, go look at the rocks and then put your back to Stonehenge and look out across Salisbury Plain, just about all 360 degrees. And either near or far, in almost every point of the compass, you will see a mound. They're burial mounds. This is where people, 3,000, at Salisbury Plain at least, 3,000, 3,500 BC, were burying people, okay? Well, this big mound at Sutnahu, when the archaeologist, guy's name I think was Basil Basingstoke, very English name, I think that was his name. He starts digging into the first mound and he discovers one thing pretty quick. Somebody's already dug into this. That is, somebody tried to rob this grave. But he keeps digging. He discovers a ship. Or he discovers the remains of a ship. The wood is all gone. I mean, totally gone. But you can see, because the soil is packed sand, it's all sandy soil, you can see in the soil, and I'll link to some pictures and stuff of this on D2L. You can see the remnants of the rivets that nailed together the clapboard that formed the hull. The ship is over 90 feet long, and if I remember right, about 20 feet wide. Big stinking ship, okay? Nearest body of water is 2 miles away, downhill. So they had to roll this ship uphill on logs and put it in this. They hollowed out a little bit of a hole, put it in, piled it over with dirt. Why is that important? Why am I spending precious time talking about it? Because it had treasure in it. Turn to page, I think it is 47. Yeah. In your book. I'll hold it up.
You told all this to us already.
Did I tell you all this?
I got notes.
I thought I.
This conversation.
Ship is pulled uphill.
Yeah, that's in the introduction. This is a gold belt buckle. Okay, it's actually a belt buckle. And it's a little bit larger than it is really. If I remember right, it's about 4 or 5 inches long. That's probably closer to 6 to 7 inches. It's solid gold. Weighs 2 or 3 pounds, if I remember correctly. It's about 1/2 inch to inch thick. Okay? Every one of those little dark dots that you see in there, it's an inlaid stone. This thing is made during what's called the Dark Ages of Europe. Okay? It wasn't dark by any means. All right? So this is found, gold coins are found, and the coins are very useful because they give us a date. They give us a date before which this thing can't have been put in the ground. And I want to say it's sometime mid 6th century to very early 7th century. And a bunch of other stuff. Part of a sword, scabbard, lyre, that like to sing to, shield, helmet, tons of stuff. Greatest archaeological discovery in England up to that point. Another huge discovery is made in 2012 called the Staffordshire Hoard. A lot more gold. So, there's a bunch of stuff found that I've just mentioned that matches very eerily to what is described in Schild's burial. course, Scyld wasn't buried, right? He was put in the boat, and the boat was sent out to the ocean. And we were told at the end of that passage that men do not know. They settled gold ensign, let the waves, gave into the sea with grieving spirits, mournful in mind. Men do not know how to say truly, not trust the counselors, nor heroes under the heavens who received that cargo. And somewhere else in there it's mentioned, that he went away in the way he came. Okay? Went away in a boat, the way he came, in a boat. Ring any bells? Who arrived as a consolation for his people in a boat? Moses. Baby in a boat, foundling, waif, if you want, okay, and becomes the deliverer of evil. Deliverer of the Hebrews. Okay, back to something new. So, there's gold. British law at the time required if gold or valuable stuff is ever discovered buried in the ground, you have to have a coroner's inquest to determine who it belongs to. Now, if you're like me, I would have said, it's my ground. It's mine. Try and take it from my cold, dead fingers. It's not how it worked. Why? Because they have to determine, is it grave goods or is it treasure? Because if it's grave goods, it belongs to one person. If it's treasure, it belongs to another person. So what's the difference between grave goods and treasure?
Grave goods would be you're robbing it, right? It still belongs to them technically.
Okay. Yes, except for the last part. Grave goods means it was put in the ground for how long? How long was it supposed to stay in the ground? Forever. It goes with the dead person. Right? Treasure means, oh, the Vikings are coming, dig a hole, stuff it, tamp it down, run away. Vikings leave, go back, dig it up, and you're up and running again. Treasure's temporary. Grave goods is permanent. One of the pieces of evidence, literally, one of the pieces of evidence entered into the coroner's inquest was this passage from Beowulf. For what purpose? Now, let me add. No body was discovered in this ship. Some people still think there was a body. Most scholars do not. There was some early chemical testing of the soil that suggested there might have been a higher concentration of phosphorus than there should have been, which could indicate a human body. Not conclusive by any means, right? But all the kind of stuff that was put around shield, sword, money bag with money, helmet, coat of mail. You can go to the British Museum and look at it. Okay, almost all of the stuff you can see there. So, what is it? Have the coroner's inquest. This is entered into evidence. The coroner weighs the evidence, and he decides this is grave goods. This was put in the ground to stay in the ground. The law is, if it's grave goods, it belongs to the person upon whose property it was discovered. That law has been changed, by the way. I think it was like in the last 30 or 40 years. Now, you still have to have a coroner's inquest. Okay? But pretty much anything that's discovered has to be reported to the local antiquities department, which is a subset of the government in England. Pretty much everything discovered kind of belongs to the country, with some exceptions, right? So, it belongs to Elizabeth Pretty. It's determined. And she immediately says, no, there's no way. This belongs to the people of England. And she donates it all to the British government, to the Crown. So if you go to the British Museum today, you can see quite a bit of material from this site, or you can go to Sutton Hoo, where there's now a museum and walking tour and all that kind of stuff, and you can see the other stuff. Some of it is still not displayed because there's so much. Like I said, there's like 40 or 50 mounds. A lot of them have been excavated. They found other stuff. Horses buried next to soldiers, apparently. Parts of the horses survived, bones and things like that, but none of the human bodies, or almost none. I think there actually are a couple of graves that do have the human bodies left. Okay? So, that's the end of the prologue. The poem itself, in one sense you could say, now really begins. In other words, now we're going to get to the real meat. And we have the first fit. The fits are how the poem is divided. You can think of it like a chapter. Or if you're Milton writing Paradise Lost, a book. Right? We're going to see the term fit used again when we discuss Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Beowulf has over 40 fits. I don't remember the exact number. 43, 44, something like that. Maybe 42. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has 4. It doesn't mean Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is 10 times longer. It's not. It's about the same length, actually. It's just the poems are divided differently. But you have these fits. So, then Beowulf shielding. Remember what I said about the word, or the, I almost said post-6. Suffix ing, son of, Beowulf, son of Scyld. Beloved king was famous in the strongholds of his folk for a long while. So he lived a long time. His father having passed away, that is Scyld, Lord from earth, until after him, this Beowulf, arose the great Halfdane, okay, who held the glorious shieldings all his life. Halfdane's an interesting character. He's, I can't think of how to put him, quasi-mythological, quasi-historical. Some people think he was real. Some people think he wasn't real. In that sense, he's like Arthur. I mean, King Arthur. Some people think there was a real King Arthur who actually lived, and that most of what we hear about him is all wrong, but that there was a figure that all the mythology is based upon. Similarly, some think that there is a figure upon whom the mythology of Halfdane and his successors is based upon. There's a large body of Old Norse literature, and people like Halfdane and Hrothgar and Hrothulf figure largely in these works, okay, in this Old Norse mythological material. Beowulf is not mentioned in any of them. ENGL, who we're going to see mentioned in just a moment, is. Okay? Froda is. A lot of other people are. Beowulf is not, for some reason. So, Beowulf shielding dies. After him comes Halfdane. That doesn't mean Beowulf shielding is the direct progenitor of Halfdane. It's the way it's kind of written. It implies passage of time. So he's like great, grandson. Halfdane has 4 children. If you look at the handout I have posted on D2L, Guide to the Feuds and Characters of Beowulf, it begins with the genealogy. I take that back. It begins with, I think, 3 genealogies. Halfdane's genealogy with his children, Hrethel's, Geats, Shieldings, Hrethel and his genealogy, his children, and Onyenthal, who's a Swede, and his children. I think those are the 3 kind of family trees that I provide. They're all going to get mixed up, so kind of keep track of them. Try. Let me put it that way. Okay? So, Halfdane becomes king. And we're told he has 4 children. Over here. Haregar, Hrothgar, Halga, an unnamed daughter. Okay? We're told Harogar, Hrothgar, Helga the Good. Yes.
So this Halfdane, are you saying half or heath? Like,
I'm saying half. Healf is pronounced half,
okay.
not health. It looks like it should be, sorry, there should be an L there,
Okay.
right? Doesn't the book have Hea? Yes. There's just my mistake. Healf. The L is usually dropped. So it's half. How do you pronounce Half? Do you say half? Some people I know do. Why? Because there's an L there. It's called a pronunciation, spelling pronunciation. Often. Historically, that's pronounced Offen. Often. No T sound. The T began being pronounced in, I think it was the 19th century. Why? Because there's a T there. You have to spell it. So why don't we say knick? We don't. We say night. We don't pronounce all the letters, so why pronounce some? And anyways, it's a downfall of the modern educational system because there's an emphasis, this idea that you got to pronounce kind of everything that's there. So, 3 boys and a girl. Notice, we're not told anything about Harogar at this point. We're going to have something told about him later because Halfdane dies, seemingly, top of the next page, and success in war was given to Hrothgar. So, doesn't become king at all? That's what's implied here. Let me just very quickly, the daughter, you've got a footnote. According to other Old Norse sources, her name is Yrsa or Ursula. All right? She's going to marry, according to these other sources, and according to the poem here, a guy named Onela, who is one of the kings that gets the appellation Fat was god king, said about it. Well, I'm going to argue it's said about him, because there's confusion. Well, disagreement as to who that refers to. Okay? Notice this parallel. 4 children, last child is an unnamed daughter. 4 children, last child is an unnamed daughter. She marries a man named Ecgtheow. They have a son. His name is Beowulf. Yes?
Are they not including their names because they're women?
We have no idea. If I remember, Lusa says a name is missing from the manuscript. And if I remember correctly, there's an actual blank. Like the poet describes copying, and he either can't read it or the source he's copying from doesn't have it. Which is really interesting because, I don't have time to go into this. The Beowulf part of the manuscript is written in 2 different hands. That is, 2 different people copy it. So a hand refers to a style of handwriting. Like my handwriting is different from all of yours. And we can tell exactly where the handwriting stops of the first scribe. And the second scribe picks up. And it's literally in the middle of a line. It's like either that scribe gets up, goes to get a cup of coffee, and drops dead of a heart attack, or something. He just stops in the middle. The second person comes up, picks up, and starts writing the rest of it. Thicker letters, darker ink, it's totally different, right? But that person also then goes back and makes corrections to the first part of Beowulf. Literally, at some points, crosses through and writes a word above. Or scrapes off with a knife and writes a new word. Or writes an alternate word above a word. Okay? But doesn't fix this blank. Probably indicating doesn't know what should be there either. Okay? So, then success in war was given to Hrothgar. Honor in battle, so that his beloved kinsmen eagerly served him till the young soldiers grew into a mighty troop of men. We're never told how mighty a troop. we are told the first night that Grendel comes, in a few pages, first night Grendel comes, he kills 30 men. Let me rephrase that. He kills and takes away 30 men. One person. How do you kill and take, there's 17 of you in here now, maybe 18. How does one person take away 18 bodies and 12 more? Louder? Okay.
He's a monster.
So describe the size.
Large.
Big, really, really big. He's not a giant. All right? So there's we are going to be told he does carry a bag. He has a man purse. It's literally a man purse. Because it's a purse made out of dragon skin. How cool is that? That he puts his snacks into. He puts men into that bag. He kills them first. You hope that they're all dead and the guy at the bottom isn't still breathing and going, let me out, let me, I would have loved to have seen a Monty Python rendition of Beowulf. I really, really wish they had done something. But that won't happen. So, Hrothgar rules for a long time. Well, it's implied. Has the idea, I want to build a big hall. Does he want to build just any big hall? You're shaking your head no. What kind of big hall does he want to build? The biggest, bestest hall that everyone will remember for all time. And he does. And there within, line 71, he would share everything with young and old that God had given him, except for the common land and the lives of men. Young and old doesn't mean all the people of his kingdom. It means young and old men. It means what's called the Yugatha and the Dugatha. The Yugatha, G-E-O. I didn't even mention that. Yugatha. I can get rid of this. G-E-O-G-U, that. And then the other one is that. Yugatha and Dugatha. It's from this word that we get modern English. Anybody know? What's it kind of sound like? Take the g out of the middle. Youth. It's the youths. The youths. Okay? These are the young warriors. These are the guys that are green. They're just kind of starting off boot camp. These guys, these are the Vietnam vets. They're the ones who have been to hell and back. They've got battle scars, and they're helping train these folks. So, Hrothgar distributes treasure to the young and old warriors, implying he's really generous. Because the young guys, they probably haven't seen much battle. They're still green, but he's still sharing out trinkets with them. But notice what he doesn't distribute. Two things. The common land, that is, the land held by all the people, like a commonwealth, that's what commonwealth kind of means, and lives of men. He doesn't deal in slaves. He doesn't trade slaves. He doesn't give slaves. Which is not at all like the later Vikings. The Vikings did take slaves. They took slaves from the people they defeated. They would take slaves from monks. They would take young boys as slaves, sometimes to train them to be warriors, other times for other reasons that we don't want to talk about. Okay? Then the work was finished, widely proclaimed to many nations throughout this Middle Earth, to come adorn the folkstead. Why was it proclaimed to come adorn the folkstead? Something is implied there. What did Shilcheving get from the surrounding nations? Tribute. This is, I would like you to come to contribute to my hall. What's implied? or I'll come take what I want you to contribute to my hall. Okay? That's why it was emphasized that he was mighty and powerful and known around this Middle Earth. So, came to pass, it was built. The hall gets named Herat, which just means heart. Word we don't use in modern English, American English, at all. We use another word. 4 letters, male deer, stag. That's what it's referring to, a stag. In fact, the hall is going to be built, if you look at it from the front, these timbers here and here are going to cross over and form antlers of sorts. Okay? So he names it Herat. He remembered his boast. That is, Hrothgar remembers his boast. What boast? What boast does the Lord make? Fight for me, I'll give you treasure. That's probably that boast. We're not told of any other boast that he makes. He gave out rings, treasure at table. That's why I think it's the Lord-Thane relationship. They fought for him, he fulfilled his end of the bargain. Rings, by the way, doesn't refer to this kind of ring. It refers to a ring that's worn around the wrist, or, for the warriors really, rings that would be worn around the bicep. And the more of them you have tells us what? Don't mess around with Fred, because he's been given all of these trophies, is essentially what they are. Think, movies you've seen of those crazy soldiers or serial killers in some cases, and they collect what? Trophies. Fingers, eyeballs, ear, whatever. Okay? So these are trophies. And we're told, the hall towered high and horn-gabled, line 82, it awaited hostile fires. What's the poet just done? Think time. The hall, we're told, towered high and horn-gabled. So the poet is looking back, still in the past, right? In the Dagon, that's when all this is set. The hall's finished. It's towering, it's high-gabled, and then it says, it awaited hostile fires. What's the awaited there mean?
Undetermined amount of time passed.
Towards the future. From the time when the hall is created, it's like we're having the ribbon cutting ceremony. I mean, within the world, as this is being described, the hall has just been completed, right? And the poet's next breath mentions what? Oh, by the way, it's going to burn to the ground. It's like they've not even gone in it yet. The ribbon that's been cut is still floating to the ground. And it's as if the director includes an image of the whole thing in flame. It awaited hostile fires, the surges of war. The time was not yet at hand. So, back at the time of the creation of the hall's made, but the time was not yet at hand. It would be in the future, but the future of that hall is still the past of when the speaker is speaking. Because the speaker knows about the fires. Time was not yet at hand when the sword hate of, and what are you expecting before you read that next line and a half? Where does war usually come from? Out there. Your enemy's over there. The surrounding nations, for example. But that's not what happens. Of sworn in-laws. What's meant by in-laws? My daughter got married last fall. I have a son-in-law. That's what's meant. Of sworn in-laws should arise after ruthless violence. In-laws. What kind of warfare is that? What term do we use to describe war within a family? Yes, thank you. Civil War. Why was the Civil War, the American Civil War, the bloodiest of all wars the United States has been involved in? Bloodier than World War I, World War II, bloodier than Vietnam, bloodier than Korea. Because brother against brother, in-law against in-law, civil, internecine, for the nice Latin word to describe it. Okay? It's got to be really bad for a father-in-law to attack a son-in-law, or son-in-law to attack a father-in-law, or a father-in-law to attack father-in-law, because in one sense they're connected, right, through that marriage. Look at the next line. This, I think, is just sheer utter brilliance on the part of the poet. And if it's not clear by now, it will be really soon. I think this is just about the greatest thing ever written. I disagree with a lot of what's presented, because there is an ideology that is presented here, partially at least, that I think the poet is actually at the same time as presenting it, the poet's kind of going, not so sure this is the best way to work things out in life. A bold demon who waited in darkness wretchedly suffered all the while. So the hall is built, they have the grand opening, and the poet immediately says, oh, by the way, it's all going to burn to the ground. Why? Civil war, which is essentially brother against brother. Where does that happen? Go back in time. Cain and Abel. A bold demon, and we get mentioned 15 lines later, a descendant of Cain. What has the poet just done? He's linked the violence that Herod is going to suffer with Cain and Abel, Garden of Eden, primary fratricide. The first murder was brother against brother. And this grim demon, bold demon, the Old English there, by the way, 84. The Old English is Ellengast. That means formidable ghost, formidable spirit, frightful ghost or spirit. Doesn't have the meaning necessarily that the modern English demon has. I wouldn't ever translate any of the words that are in, except for maybe one or two, as demon. Because what does demon connote in popular consciousness? Came from hell, fallen angel, supernatural being. Grendel is not a supernatural being at all. And you're going to get demon, fiend, spirit, all used to describe Grendel. At the same time, I mean, literally within lines later, man. In fact, he's going to be called line, no, I didn't write it down there, line 104. This miserable man, won Sally where? So, which is he? Spirit, demon, fiend, or man? Spirit and man, those are pretty two concrete things that are very, very different. So, he waits in the darkness, suffers all the while. All the while implies what about time? It's going. If you say while I, what does the while mean? You're going to wait. You're going to be doing something during the time period while somebody else is doing something else. He suffered all the while, for every day he heard the joyful din loud in the hall, with the harp sound, the clear song of the shope. What angers Grendel? It's like Cadman's in there singing his damn hymn. He hears the song of the shope, the singer, the poet. And I wasn't joking about Cadman. I'm not saying Cadman is literally there. But what does the Shope sing about? Creation, like Cadman's hymn. It's like, go back for a second, 55. Nu schulen herjan heaven reaches word, meer tot machta and his mudjethank. Werk wulder vader, swahi wunder je was. Each adrichten ora stelde, he Shope yelde bernum. Heaven to hrova hali shippen. Tha middenjaard man kennis word. Each adrichten after teada, fearum full on frail almighty. Now we ought to praise heaven kingdom's guardian, the maker's might is mind thoughts, the work of the glory Father, as he of each of wonders, the eternal Lord established a beginning. He first shaped heaven as a roof and then earth, etc. The only difference between that and the song that is alluded to is this poet's song goes into more detail. It's more like the biblical Genesis because it talks about the ancient tale of the origin of men said that the Almighty created the earth, a bright and shining plain, embraced by seas, that is, he separated the firmament above from the, etc., and set triumphantly the sun and moon, added the distant corners, leaves, branches. You've got the stages of Genesis creation described there. And notice, what effect does that have on Grendel? He just sits there and listens to that, and he gets more and more angry. Why? Could be because of what comes next. Could also be, where's Grendel? Outside. Not inside. Not participating. John Gardner, who was an Old English scholar and a novelist, wrote a novel in the mid-70s, I think it's 72, 74, called Grendel. And it's the story from Grendel's perspective. I think it's a horrible story. A lot of people use it still. A lot of people use it in Old English courses. It's told entirely from Grendel's perspective. The problem, obviously, based on this at least, is we don't know what Grendel's perspective is other than that he's usually angry or hungry. That's it. So, this lordly people lived in joy blessedly until one began to work his foul crimes, a fiend from hell. He was called Grendel. We don't know who called him that. It's just he was called. I mean, who named him that? Some people think Grendel comes from the verb grendon. Take a guess as to what that means. Look at the first part. To grind. Because of what happens when he eats people. He grinds them, you know. He held the moors and fens. This miserable man lived for a time in the land of the giants after the Creator had condemned him among Cain's race. He is a descendant of Cain. Interestingly, in the manuscript, line 107, this is what the manuscript reads. C-A-M-E-S. The only difference between this and this in the manuscript, there's no doubt, is this looks like that. See, these are called minims. If you take that off, and you take that off, and you take that off, you can actually, think of the word all that really is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 straight lines. Okay? And some of those lines are joined either at the top or at the bottom. They're called minims. Right? The manuscript has this minim connected to this minim. So it reads C-A-N-E-S. Well, that doesn't make much sense. But it can. I'm not saying it's correct. Okay? Because Kames can mean of battle, of warfare, of conflict. Because he was of the race of battle, conflict, warfare. Child of conflict kind of a thing. But that still doesn't make any sense because of what comes in the next half line. When he killed Abel. By the way, it's the only explicit biblical reference in the entire poem. Only one. There's no other references to the God of the Old Testament or to any Old Testament figures or New Testament figures. None whatsoever. Just this one. Okay? And it's 11:05, so we will stop there and we will pick up with the Lord avenging that death.